Today I'm speaking with Dr. Kurt Weyland. Kurt is currently the Mike Hogg Professor in Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin. His research interests focus on social policy, policy diffusion, democratization, authoritarian rule, and populism. In addition, he's the author and editor of many books and articles, but today we will be talking about his latest book, Democracy's Resilience to Populism's Threat, Countering Global Alarmism. Yes, that's the book. Really a great book. And thanks for writing it. Kurt, welcome to Pluralist Points.
Good. Yeah, thank you for having me. I'll be interested in talking to you.
Yeah. So since the Brexit vote in 2016, there's been a lot of talk about rising populism. You're the expert and you follow this consistently. Is populism on the rise?
Populism is on the rise, not as dramatically as people think, but there has been an increase in several regions of the world. I mean, even in Western Europe, they are advancing slowly. In Latin American countries, populism has long had a strong presence, but they keep going and producing new variants. And then in Eastern Europe, there's also, and in other regions of the world, more in India, I think there is a gradual advance. People think of this massive global wave, and I think that's exaggerated, but there is a gradual advance, both in the electoral strength of populists, in the reaching government office, and also in, I think, the damage they do to democracy. They've become a little more successful, partly because they inspire and learn from each other. So the problem for liberal democracy is increasing. As I said, not as dramatically as many people fear, but we need to be alert to this.
Yeah. Is this mainly due to, economic dislocation, cultural tensions? What do you attribute this rise in populism to?
It's hard to say. I think, and there have been interminable debates, and the different analysis. Some show more the economic side, others show more the cultural side. I think that both of those types of factors matter because with globalization, increasing inequality in a bunch of countries, there are more and more people who are left behind and who are, for that reason, discontented. I also do believe that really quite quick advance of liberal values across the world has provoked a certain cultural backlash. And I think there is a third factor that accounts for the gradual rise of populism, which is that our modern democracies have to deal with so many hyper-complex problems that for common people, it's harder and harder to understand what's going on. And that, in some sense, provides an opening for populists to say, look at all these establishment politicians, look at all these experts. They tell you all this complicated stuff, and they haven't resolved a thing, but I have the solution. Think of U.S. immigration, a phenomenally complex issue area that hasn't been resolved. Here came Trump in 2015-16. All you need to do is build a wall, right? And people are like, oh, wow, the guy must be a genius. And so I think that is a third factor that provides sort of space for populists to, draw citizens who are just baffled by the phenomenal complexity of modern politics with their simplistic slogans and exaggerated promises.
Yeah. Does populism have a life cycle? Like, is there, a place where it starts and then it crystallizes at a certain point and then it eventually declines, or it crystallizes and then is sustained over a long period of time? Do you think about it in terms of life cycles?
So you mean populism as a political phenomenon? You mean individual populist experiences? Because in my view, individual populist experiences by nature have a life cycle because, by my definition, populism revolves around personalistic and plebiscitarian leadership. These are not organized movements. They don't usually have disciplined political parties. The populists don't have reliable support. So they rise, but they can also fall fairly dramatically. And sooner or later, a populist leader, they initially campaign by being outsiders, but the longer they're in government, they're not outsiders anymore. The longer they're in government, their often incompetence, corruption shows. And so there tends to be a sort of natural life cycle of individual populists. The problem is that populism is very flexible, and they're very savvy, and they can rise based on a great variety of different issues, problems, representation deficits. And so we see that especially in the Latin American experiences, because we've had populism for decades,
Yeah.
different versions. And so populism as such, even if individual experiences rise and fall, populism as such pops up again. I mean, in Latin America, there have been a number of occasions, like after the military regimes of the 60s and 70s, that scholars thought populism is finished, and poof, it pops up again. And there were right-wing neoliberal populists in the 90s, and when they were exhausted, people thought, well, that was it. Neoliberalism would preclude populism, and here, boof, comes Hugo Chavez and has a different version of populism, and after that falls with the end of the global commodities boom, boof, you have Bolsonaro, and you have Milei, and so, the individual experiences have a life cycle. Populism as a movement has more kind of power of popping up. It's not persistence, but they are savvy, and they find the way of the opening that allows new versions to rise.
Yeah. Now let's double click on the definition for a second. You used the term personalistic plebiscitarianism. Most people, when they think about populism, I think they're thinking about sort of an anti-elite phenomenon. Why do you pick this term in particular? Can you unpack it for us?
No, absolutely. Because, many people think of populism in terms of the discourse and the rhetoric that populist leaders have. And populist leaders essentially pit the pure, authentic people that have been neglected and excluded against these corrupt, selfish elites. And they claim that they have the cause of the people in mind, in finally giving them their rightful space in politics and whatever. But that is the big deception of populism, because populism does not empower the people. It, in virtually every case, revolves around a powerful, domineering leader, and that is the axis of populism. And so I think the definitions and understandings that emphasize the people versus the elite, they fall for this populist deception. They fall for the promise, we empower the people. But that promise is used to empower the leader in every single case. Even people like, oh, Hugo Chavez was a left-winger and he created all these participatory institutions and he empowered the Venezuelan people. Nonsense. He made all the decisions. And so I think if you really want to understand populism as a political scientist, not the rhetoric and not the discourse, you need to understand that the core political phenomenon of populism is this leadership. And it's leadership that is very overbearing, strong leaders who think that they have this phenomenal prowess and capacities to do things that your regular professional politician can't do. And I call that personalistic, because it's anti-institutional. It's outside of institutions. It was the person of the leader. Trump, can do these things. And then the other feature is that they do not base their support on organization, on intermediaries, on established parties, but they have this direct appeal to the people in this plebiscitarian way. I'm a representative of the people and I reach them directly. I bypass the parties and the intermediaries. And, nowadays they do it by social media. Before they did it by TV. Juan Perón did it by convoking 1 million people in front of the presidential palace, and you speak to people directly. And then that has features that we can talk about later that characterize populism. But the crucial thing is, if you want to understand populism, and especially if you want to understand populism's impact on democracy, you need to really put the central focus on the leaders.
That's interesting. So it's personalistic. It's about sort of the strong, domineering leader, and they're sustained by a sort of plebiscitarian fervor, the people, the masses.
Direct appeal to the people that is almost, like person. I mean, so like Hugo Chavez had this TV program for like 6-8 hours every Sunday. He was in people's living room talking to them as if they were their friend, right? And so you want to have this direct connection. Trump, in the first government with his tweet storms, people were constantly glued. What's the new tweet from Trump? So you have this direct connection, but it's organizationally flimsy, right? These are your followers, but they could unfollow or cancel you if you wanted to. So what do you have to do to maintain and build your followership? You have to intensify that linkage. You have to make it emotional. You have to make it such that these people are, I don't know how to say that, sort of seduced, glued to hearing from you. And how do you do that? Essentially by depicting your adversaries as enemies, as nefarious forces. And so you transform politics from democratic competition into a war, confrontation, polarization. What you essentially try to do is you try to provoke sort of rally around the flag. Here are the bad elites who are trying to exploit you and take advantage of you, and I'm protecting you. So all circle of wagons around me because I need your support to promote your cause. And so you see how populism, because of the flimsiness of its support base, that in principle is precarious. You have to supercharge it. You have to make it really fervent. And that leads to that penchant for confrontation, for constantly provoking, for always picking fights. And that makes populism then also so deleterious for civil discourse, for compromise, for, what we think is a crucial factor of pluralist, liberal democratic politics.
Yeah. And so you mentioned the term, the polarization. I think that populism by its very nature is polarizing because it engages in this sort of us versus them, rhetoric and, actual sort of behavior.
Correct. And so it's not like, I give you a programmatic offer and a competition and let's debate and let's discuss, but like I'm the incarnation of the good and they're the incarnation of the evil. So we have to fight them. We have to, lock them up. We have to drive them off the radar. If we pull a few tricks to skew the playing field, to infringe on norms, that's what you do when you're in a battle for life and death. And you see how this goes downhill.
Right, right. So now populism oftentimes is trying to counter, liberal pluralism, right, as you say, or the democratic system. What makes the system so resilient against populism, right? What are some of the institutional or cultural factors and norms that help to maintain liberal pluralism in the face of populist challenges?
So I think it's partly, the old Madisonian idea, the self-interest of other politicians who don't want to get pushed to the side and who therefore balance and constrain and limit what a populist leader wants to do. I mean, they don't just want to be pushed aside by this. So partly it's sort of self-interest and institutional design, fragmentation. You have a checks and balances system and the courts have a certain task and they're not just going to like concede to some populist assault, right? Ultimately, it rests on, I think, the appreciation that many people have for their freedom, for their liberty, for their rights of participation. Also, I think what you see is very important is it tends to be that populists find more support among less educated sectors and overall, more support among less educated and less support among educated sectors, because for people like us, this populist style, they're full of themselves, they're crass. I mean, would you want to own Mar-a-Lago? I mean, the place is like, it's like, the way the whole performance that they have, the cussing and the insulting and the corruption that goes hand in hand very often with this personalism, and the loyalists, the fawning loyalists with whom they surround themselves. And I mean, and so that is it's almost an aesthetic thing, right? I mean, the Argentine educated middle class, they couldn't stand Carlos Menem because he was sort of crass and like blonde supermodels and red sports cars. And if you're an educated person, like, ugh. And so all these things, I think, come together. Self-interest, commitment to democratic norms, and then sort of an aversion to the populist style, these populist performances.
Yeah. So it seems to me that you're saying competition is the thing that eventually is able to counter populism.
Very important. Yeah, absolutely. And so,
Interesting.
as long as institutions hold and we can prevent a populist leader from skewing the playing field too badly, in European countries, they suffer electoral defeats like Poland, right? I mean, in the Polish case, that right-wing Peace Party looked like they had electoral victory wrapped up in 2023 and they lost. Modi in India, people thought, oh my God, he's sailing to a third term. Bang, got one on the nose. In Latin American countries, it's very hard to defeat populist incumbents in elections, but there are other ways to contain them, and a whole bunch of them have lost office to irregular ousters, mass protests, the scandal blows up in their face, the personalistic rule suddenly implodes when there is some glaring scandal that emerges. So there are ways, if the opposition kind of manages to contain them, manages to wear them down, there's some time. Look.
But in your book, in a third of the cases that you studied, you show that populism did a lot of damage and actually did survive. And so maybe we can't be too optimistic about democracy's resilience.
So in that book, I looked at 40 cases, and of the 40 cases, 7 actually really destroyed democracy. A bunch of other ones did kind of temporary damage to democracy. But in 7 cases, populism really, I use the metaphors of suffocating and strangling because it's a gradual process. It's not like the old military coups, usually it's not like boom, but it's like gradual, slippery slope, more and more power concentration, more and more corrosion of institutional safeguards. And at some point or other, think of Orban in Hungary, right? They did everything almost completely in formal legal ways. But sooner or later you go down. So in 7 cases that happened. But so then of course what I do is I look at what are the conditions why democracy was destroyed in those 7 cases and not in the other 33. And that's how I come up with this argument that the populist destruction of democracy does not only require a certain pre-existing institutional weakness, but it also requires that at the same time, these populist assailants benefit from unusual conjunctural opportunities. So in the case of the Latin American left-wingers like Chavez, the global commodities boom gave them a huge windfall of resources with which they could literally buy support. And if you buy support and you have 70% popularity, you strangle democracy. And in the case of right-wingers in Europe and in Latin America, it was in some sense the opposite. Acute, severe, but resolvable crisis like hyperinflation. Like hyperinflation devastates the population there, like in despair. Here comes a populist, and with the boldness of a populist leader, imposes a stabilization program that is painful, but if that succeeds in dissolving and bringing inflation down, like Fujimori did in Peru, they are the hero. But to go beyond the details of their arguments, the basic point is populist leaders can destroy democracy only when they benefit from exogenous, given, objective, special conditions. They can't create these conditions, only if, in some sense, a windfall falls in their lap, only if they encounter a crisis and they can manage it. And those are exceptional. Those are unusual. And so if you are a president and there is no windfall and there is no crisis, in my finding, you can do some pushing and shoving and do some damage and, like in Poland, but sooner or later, you're not succeeding in strangling democracy.
Mm-hmm. Have there been some false alarms, like leaders who came in with a kind of a populist flavor and ended up not being populist at all?
So usually a populist is a populist, but what you see is this, and I'm not sure it's a false alarm or somehow
Moderating?
But think, for example, there was one very clear alarm that was very justified, which was with Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who was a real hard right kind of, you could just see the guy's autocratic inclinations and aspirations, if he had had his way. But Brazilian democracy survived. So was it a false alarm? No, I think it was in some sense like, whoa, we have to pay attention, so we have to be alert. But I think there is false alarm, and that's why the book has a subtitle, Countering Global Alarmism, is that people and observers think they overestimate the capacity of populists to do damage to democracy and destroy democracy. And so you have all these books like, oh my God, with the rise of populism, democracy faces such a hard time. You have people now, I think, I haven't seen it, but I think my colleague and friend Steve Levitsky, Trump is undoing American democracy. You had, what was his name? I think Robert Kagan write this thing like in 2023, the US is headed towards authoritarian rule. That is so exaggerated. The populists are bad news if they get their way. The logic of populism is power concentrating. It's pushing up against checks and balances. Kind of the logic is expansive and does damage if it can unfold. But democracy is significantly stronger than people think. There are counter forces. Institutions often hold. Even weak institutions like in Latin America and Eastern Europe often hold.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, what I think people underestimate, these populists have their own weaknesses. The fact that they surround themselves with loyalists and they don't listen to experts, they make a lot of mistakes. Some leaders manage to overcome serious crises. Other populist leaders face serious crises and they fail, and boof, here they go down. Yeah. And so or what I mentioned, this plebiscitarian mass support, the flimsy, precarious base of populism. You can be a hero now, and your popularity can plummet. Like Hugo Chavez was re-elected with a majority in 2000, and he was he did such clear attacks on democracy that by 2002, 2003, his popularity had plummeted. And so populism has this volatility. You can be a hero and you can be a villain. And so a whole bunch of them fall by the wayside.
Now, you mentioned Chavez. His successor, Maduro, you wouldn't categorize as populist, right?
No.
Okay.
Because personalistic plebiscitarian. Right. Maduro is a dud. Maduro is a bore. Think somebody who could be less charismatic, right? That's the reason why he always invokes Chavez. He needs Chavez's glow because he himself has none.
And so that's simple authoritarianism, basically.
But what you see is the following. Actually, I wrote an article about that because what you see is the following. Hugo Chavez, he had tremendous magnetism. He had genuine mass support. It was undemocratic, but he had majoritarian support. So Hugo Chavez didn't have to be very repressive. Chavez dies, Maduro takes over, and it's like, oh, how am I going to hold this thing together? I have no magnetism. I have much less genuine support. well, what do you need to do? The opposition, like, oh, this guy is much weaker. Let's challenge him. So then what am I going to do? Woof, you crack down.
I see. Now, in the book, you talk about how some of the indices that rank democracies are skewed because scholars tend to be left of center and are more lenient with some of the left-leaning populist leaders. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Are we missing some of these aspects of populism, or when populism emerges because we are not sort of looking at it from the right frame?
So you see these rankings tend to be fairly tough on right wingers, like Orban. I mean, Orban in Hungary, I would say yes, by now this is a competitive authoritarian regime because he's very firmly entrenched. He gerrymandered, he skewed the electoral playing field. He was not very repressive, but he was considered, competitive authoritarian. Evo Morales in Bolivia, who is a left winger, I mean, Evo Morales pushed a new. So Orban got a supermajority. He had a new constitution done completely legally, undemocratic, but completely legally. He didn't violate a legal norm. Hugo Chavez had less of a majority, so he pushed a new constitution through a constituent assembly, partly by literally excluding the opposition. They put like armed people around the assembly and didn't let the opposition enter. Then they negotiated, and in the negotiation, Morales promised that he would only run for one more re-election. As soon as he was more firmly in the saddle, he literally laughed at them and said, "You fools, you believe they were going to perform? Of course I'm not going to."
Right.
He, in the meantime, he like half the opposition leaders. I mean, he did what Donald Trump promised and didn't do. He locked them up or he drove them into exile. He destroyed the opposition. So then, after he got reelected for his third term, he, of course, was insatiable enough to want a fourth term. He lost the referendum and then got the Supreme Court that was government dependent to concoct some funky ruling that it was a human right to be reelected. And we then still didn't classify that regime as competitive authoritarian. I mean, like, what does it take? What does it take for a left-winger? Orban did in some sense much less and was considered competitive authoritarian. Morales had done much more, and they were like, "Ooh."
Yeah. So, in your research, have you found any strategies or approaches that policymakers or, groups in civil society can use to sustain pluralism when populists gain power?
So this is a very difficult question because in some sense, what I mentioned, populists destroy democracy when they benefit from objectively given conjunctural opportunities. Like there's a huge windfall of resources the president can spend freely, or there is this huge crisis. And if you resolve it, like Bukele did in El Salvador, in some sense, he had this suffocating gang violence. He just locked up tens of thousands of people. He, in the perception of the population, he extinguished the violence. They feel free. They can play in the park again, whatever. So given that these conditions are objectively given, the opposition in some sense can't do that much in those cases. I mean, you're not going to take the oil windfall away from Hugo Chavez, who can just spend, right? You're not going to take the success against hyperinflation and the shining path gorilla away from Fujimori, who is the hero and has 80% approval. And what are you doing against 80% approval? Nothing. And so the opposition's chances in the really dangerous cases, I think the opposition's chances are by nature limited. What are you going to do against Bukele right now? His popularity has started to come down a little, but he's not defeatable. You as opposition, you want to mark presence, you want to criticize, but I mean, you're not going to dislodge that guy anytime soon. It's in
Yeah.
some sense in the intermediate cases when a populist does reasonably well but doesn't benefit from these exceptional opportunities. Cases like Carlos Menem in Argentina, who lowered hyperinflation, but he didn't have another big success. And so the institutions held, and you contain, and you assert your rights in Congress, and you invoke the courts, and you criticize them with the media. Alvaro Uribe in Colombia, or then later Nestor and Cristina Kirchner in Argentina. In those settings, opposition action is very important. You use, as much as you can, you use established institutions. You also try to use your strength in civil society, but protests can be more iffy because if they lead to violence, then it's like, look at the opposition. They are chaotic. I need to impose law and order. So that's more of a, somewhat risky strategy. So first and foremost, the stronger the institutions are, the more you want to rely on and the more you can rely on them to contain and limit.
Yeah. Now, oftentimes when we hear populism, we think of it negatively, and perhaps rightly so. But are there aspects of populism that are positive? Like, is it surfacing some information that is important for us to be aware of and to address? I think in the beginning you talked about, sort of the rise of populism being a result of certain, complex problems that we see in society, right? So I was wondering whether there are some aspects of it that we should be paying attention to.
Look, this is a very good and difficult issue. And I wouldn't say that populism has a lot of positive sides, but populism is a sign of trouble that the liberal democratic forces should take seriously and need to address. Because populism, populism emerges because a whole bunch of people are discontented. And so we need to see, and a whole bunch of discontent you can't deal with because there's too much going on and too many demands and whatever. But if this grows, you need to do something or other to try to address it. Economic dislocation with compensation, social measures, facilitating education. The cultural backlash, maybe by just holding a little on the advance of all these cultural values and reassuring the more traditionalist sectors that you're not kind of just pushing them into a system that they don't like. And I don't know how you address this problem with the complexity of modern life, because opening up participation is difficult. But when you think of it in general, populists benefit from representational deficits. So issues that the established politicians don't want to address. Now, there are issues that the established politicians have good reasons not to address. So like when I grew up in Europe, after every heinous crime, there was like, we shouldn't have the death penalty. You might not want to touch that one, right? but think about something like immigration. So for reasons that we might all disagree with, a whole bunch of people are worried about immigration. And of course, it's a paradoxical demand because every single advanced industrialized country needs immigrants because they don't reproduce in sufficient numbers. And, their population decline needs to be compensated somehow. So, you're like, what's wrong with you people? But it so happens that people are worried about immigration. And I think they're worried especially about what people call illegal immigration, where they think the states and governments have lost control and people just come and come and come, like in this so-called refugee crisis of 2015, just like a billion people pressing in and they can't keep them out. So now that is not an issue that the establishment wanted to deal with for all kinds of reasons, but somehow or other, you need to do something because if the discontent keeps growing and festering, all you do is providing, more opportunities for these populists to make headway. And so in that sense, populism is a sign of trouble. And I think, the establishment politicians, liberal Democrats are well advised to pay attention to this and see what can be done. Can we somehow regulate immigration more? Can we do something to make it harder to come in illegal ways? Can we foster immigration that people would find more palatable? Like, we are going to identify like professions that we need. We need nurses, we need teachers. So we are going to go out and recruit these people in a more proactive way rather than seeming to be overwhelmed by people just pressing in. But I think something has to be done. And so in that sense, and populism doesn't have the solutions, right? Because as I told you, Donald Trump is absolutely right. The immigration system in the United States is broken. Everybody knows it. It's completely dysfunctional, it's chaotic and whatever. He is right. But building a wall is not going to resolve these problems. And so that's why I'm saying populism doesn't have a positive side because they don't provide a solution, but it is a sign of some kind of alert to something brewing, something going, something that needs addressing somehow or other in ways that are more rational, that are more systematic, that are more kind of long-term perspective than what the populists with their simplistic promises advocate, but something has to be done.
Yeah. So I'm curious, as a political scientist, scholar who has been thinking a lot about democracy and all of these issues, what compelled you, or should I say inspired you to write this particular book in this moment?
So, this topic of populism has been on my radar screen, and I've thought and written about it for literally 35 years. When I was doing my dissertation research in Brazil, there was the rise of a right-winger that seemed to be kind of populist, and that was strange. We want to call it a mellow. And so I followed this for the longest time, but I've never really written a book about it. And so, and I paid attention to Fujimori and Menem and Chavez and all these characters. So I had a lot of research kind of done along the way that I'd never. But then what motivated me to do this was the outpouring of books of doom and gloom that started, especially with Trump's election. So, and as I say, I mean, Levitsky and Seeblatt wrote a wonderful book. It's an excellent book, but it's too dark, right? And a whole bunch of other people like, oh my God, doom and gloom. And what frankly started to, when there was one book of like this after the other, what started to bother me is I think there is sort of an incentive to write doom and gloom because bad news sells. And, if you can tell people like Trump is a fascist, they're all like bent out of shape. And I thought, okay, now let's look at what actually happens. And yes, populism is a problem, as I've seen, but I've also seen along the way many populists fail and don't succeed, and many democracies survive. So let's kind of provide some balance based on comprehensive, systematic research. We need to, kind of, what should I say, that lower the temperature a little, lower this like, oh my God, populism is just like the end of democracy. It started, I mean, if I can say it in a personal way, it started getting on my nerves, And so it's like, okay, now look at this. And because, I mean, you see how the human mind works. I think the cases in which populism does a ton of damage, they are on people's mind. But that distorts our judgment. I think when populists fail, like Bolsonaro didn't get reelected in Brazil, people pay little attention, then it kind of drops off the radar screen. When in Poland they fail and don't get reelection, there isn't enough attention to that. We need, and so I think people's perception is skewed. Ooh, there's Chavez who did it, and oh, there's Erdogan who did it, and oh, there's Bukele who did it. But we also need to keep in mind the many other cases. Now, a lot of these people are forgotten. I mean, when you look at my book, there are case studies of people who, Bucaram of Ecuador, Serrano of Guatemala, Castillo of Peru, that were like blips episodes, and they're forgotten. But in analytical terms, those are important cases too.
Right.
Because we need to see not only where does a populist, where do they really destroy democracy, but also where was it beginning, but it was stopped, it was contained, they themselves failed. These are not the cases that, people, they should find them fascinating, but, they haven't drawn the attention. They are not in people's memory.
Yeah.
And so our whole perception is distorted. And the book tries to balance this. The book tries to put it in perspective.
Yeah. Now, as we, wrap this up, I want to go back to the title of the book, and I'm curious about what your call to action is. I mean, you're basically saying that there is maybe too much alarmism about populism, and the subtitle says countering global alarmism. What's the best way to counter global alarmism? What should be our approach as we see, populism emerge?
So I think, when populist leaders rise in the political and electoral arena, we should try to see which ones of the grievances that they feed on we can address and diminish and win people back, or at least make sure that they don't win more and more support. What I said about the representation deficits. I think we have to be willing to jettison some of our own predilections and preferences to accommodate people who we don't like that much, but we don't want to fall to the populists. I think that is important, and it is painful, and people don't like doing it, and that's why it's done too little. But I think that's the only way of kind of stemming the advance of populists in the electoral arena, make it harder for them to reach government office. When they've reached government office, I think really my first recommendation would be try to use established institutions. Now, there are settings where the institutions are so weak that you might have to resort to other means. Their protests, their civil society are indispensable, because if you have an institutional framework that's crumbling left and right, you can't contain them with checks and balances. So it depends very much on the specific situation. And that's in some sense, I mentioned, populists are savvy. They use specific opportunities in specific countries. There isn't one common recipe. They have a nose for what's brewing, where are the grievances, where are the unaddressed problems, and they seize on them. And I think the liberal democratic opposition has to be equally savvy. What is it that they're using? They're using this grievance here. They're using that grievance there. They're using this trick here. They're making alliances with this over there. Or, for example, in terms of institutional containment, it obviously depends very much on the institutional setup of the specific country. You have, like in the United States, one very important mechanism of containment is federalism. It's an additional safeguard in addition to the checks and balances at the federal level. You have federalism, where you have a unitary state like El Salvador. Oops, you don't have that. You have fewer lines of defense, and so it depends very much. Parliamentary system, different thing from presidential system. Presidential system, clearer separation of powers, you can contain. Parliamentarism, more kind of you work in the party system, because many of the populist leaders who rise in parliamentary systems, they don't win majorities, they have coalitions. And so you want to work on that and kind of see whether you can undermine their coalition.
Is there one that is more effective against populism?
No,
or it doesn't really matter?
Because traditionally, there's been long-standing this argument that presidentialism is more dangerous, and you would think that would be especially propitious for populism, because presidents directly elected, domineering personalistic leadership. But one result of my book is I don't find that big a difference, because you see that in parliamentary systems, populist leaders have also risen. They have also destroyed democracy. In some sense, they attenuated separation of powers in the parliamentary system. Like Orban, if you win a majority, and especially if you're in a supermajority, you have, in some sense, much more open path to concentrating power, to weakening checks and balance, and a president where there's more separation of powers.
Mm-hmm.
And so overall, I think it is, in terms of the risk to democracy, overall, I think it's a wash. Both systems are equal strengths and weaknesses, but they're different. In the presidential system, the institutional separation of powers is more of an obstacle for a populist. In the parliamentary system, it's the party coalition that often they have to hold together. Think, for example, people like, oh my God, Geert Wilders won the election in Holland, right? I mean, 24% of the seats in parliament, finally managed to cobble together a coalition where he isn't even the prime minister. How much damage is it going to do?
Yeah. Well, Kurt, this has been an insightful conversation. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. The book is called Democracy's Resilience to Populism's Threat, Countering Global Alarmism.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was very interesting for me too. Thanks.